We are a country, actually speaking, we are the last frontier of Asia. Everywhere else is done now. We are raw, we are authentic, our culture still holds, people are generally still very friendly and very open. There has been no mutilation of what we are yet.
If we went to Arugambe today and asked hotel owners what it looked like in the 1950s and 60s, most will not be able to tell you. How many people in Colombo and the decision-making seats know that Arugambe was actually a destination where Sinhala planters from Uva and the Badulla Hills would go down to hunt?
Tourism falls under every remit, whether even agriculture has a role to play, coast conservation, fisheries, irrigation, pretty much deals with almost every government department or ministry. That poses its challenges because you have to manage their competing interests. But what we would like to encourage is that tourism should be that enabler.
Hi, I'm Senith Abeyanayake, Research Associate at the Center for a Smart Future. CSF, alongside Echelon Media, are organizing a series of panel discussions that focus on taking Sri Lanka towards a nature-positive economy, where we delve into discussions and important factors that we need to consider when rethinking Sri Lanka's post-economic recovery trajectory into a growth path that truly embeds nature at its heart. We have three panelists today with diverse experiences and expertise in Sri Lankan tourism policy and practice. We have a consultant and expert, Chalana Perera, the founder of RETRACE Hospitality, a consultancy specializing in regenerative tourism and hospitality asset management. He's also an international expert, regularly contributing to conversations in both local and international academia and research. We have a hospitality entrepreneur, Nilanka Martinus, the co-founder and managing director of Mosvold Boutique Hotels, which includes several award-winning boutique hotels. And we also have a government policy lead, Rashmini Mather, with experience in media and communications and government policy for over 15 years. She was a consultant to the Sri Lankan government on tourism, leading the formulation of policies such as the Tourism Vision 2025 by Sri Lanka and also the Tourism Strategic Plan from 2017 to 2019. So let's set the context. Sri Lanka has gone through multiple and overlapping crises, starting from the 2019 Easter Sunday bombings to COVID to the economic crisis. And the tourism sector has directly been impacted by all three. So where is the Sri Lankan tourism industry, the sector right now, and where is it heading? And more importantly, is the tourism sector in Sri Lanka in a position and space to rethink its trajectory? So maybe we can start with Nilanka.
When you think of what has happened to us over the last 4 to 5 years, let's be very honest. Everybody in tourism now is looking at how do we come out of this little hole that we've been in for 4 to 5 years, starting from 19. Actually, before that, even 18, when we had the constitutional crisis, it affected things a little bit, you know. So when we go out to stakeholders, and a majority of our stakeholders are SMEs in tourism, a lot of them are not registered, a lot of them are providing a service to tourists who are here. And you tell them, okay, after 4 years of no money, let's talk about nature positivity. We have to also be realistic there. Having said that, the bigger players in the market, the medium enterprises, the large enterprises, should still think about this, even given the situation they have been in, because they always have a longer term view. We will always think 15, 20 years ahead, not in terms of business plan, but in terms of how we are as a country, how we grow as a brand. Maybe we have to think that far ahead. So overall, there is going to be an imbalance because we don't have a lot of large players. We have a lot of smaller players. And then taking this nature positive thinking and approach to them has to be tailor-made to their sort of how they want to take it up, what they are comfortable with. You know, it's baby steps. This is reality on the ground now. Should it be a situation where we need to think about it? 100% yes, everyone, from the bottom right to the top. Because we are a country, actually speaking, We are the last frontier of Asia. Everywhere else is done now. We are raw, we are authentic, our culture still holds. People are generally still very friendly and very open. There has been no mutilation of what we are yet. Nature positivity can also do this in terms of the culture. Yes, one, our environs, which is very important. If we spoil this, what are we offering? So I feel, and I'm sure the others do as well, this needs to be on the agenda at the top of it if we are going to look at tourism as a major revenue earner for this country going forward. If you're going to build on it, like Rashmini has done already, the strategic plan for tourism as a whole has to have nature, which is what basically people are coming for, right on top.
So Chalana, Nilanka said that we should think about nature positive approaches to tourism. Can you give us an understanding on what nature positive looks like practically in a tourism business model? How has it worked around the world, and what does it really look like?
In the context of Sri Lanka as a destination, it's quite convenient because we are a globally recognized and sought after biodiversity hotspot, right? And being a biodiversity hotspot means that your product is entirely its biodiversity, right? The biodiversity of the island. People are attracted to Sri Lanka because there's actually a reputation of the brand name for much longer than our independent history, right? This goes back to millennia. So nature is the core of Sri Lanka's tourism product. If you want to talk about nature positivity in a tourism sense, it's about feeding back in to the systems that you're extracting from, right? In the capitalist model of doing business, you're typically taking out to then create profit, right? And then that has evolved into having a bit of CSR or some kind of fund that donates on the side. But nature positive tourism is the core business reinstates your very asset that you are capitalizing, which is tourism, which is nature. So this is looking at measures such as air quality, water quality, soil quality, biodiversity indices, and it's very simple, Senith. Actually, we've just fundamentally set the wrong KPIs, right? The key performance indicators, not only in this country but the world over, have been really billions of dollars and millions of arrivals. But interestingly, there are countries which are destinations in their own right with lower GDP per capita than Sri Lanka and also lower reserves than Sri Lanka that have been modeling phenomenally with nature positive tourism, the likes of Bhutan, the likes of Rwanda, Botswana, far less resourced than we are, right? And you can talk about issues in governance and accountability that maybe are mirrored in those destinations, but they have understood what is sacred about that sense of place. And that's where Sri Lanka has fundamentally gone wrong, particularly post-war. And that's where we've lost the element of nature. Some of the most beautiful, some of the most wild, and some of the highest value destinations within Sri Lanka, we can call them micro-destinations, are actually areas which were under the civil war for 30 years. And fortunately for them, as sensitive as this may be, they have not been developed, right? And if you look at places that were typically developed, they were developed in a reactive manner, offshoots of the hippie trail in the 1950s and 60s, right? And these were coastal towns. Now, the waves and the sand and the dunes and the mangroves and the shrubland and the salt marsh and all of these estuaries, they're not built by capital and infrastructure. Those are natural assets that were gifted to us by the powers that be, right? So it's just coming back to that in every shape and form.
Understood. So now just bridging what Nilanka you said, right? So on a macro level, you said that a country doesn't need to be economically advanced to start thinking about nature positive measures and also incorporating those indicators into their modeling. So bringing that into the micro level, does a business need to reach a certain state for them to start seriously implementing nature positive changes to their model? Or are there things that small and medium enterprises in the tourism industry right now that could start with, given the means and the resources that they have when it comes to nature positivity?
No business needs to be in a specific state. The entrepreneur, the owner, the investor, the stakeholders in that business, so the people behind a business, an enterprise, even if a sole proprietorship, needs to have the right mindset. And they can be, resource scarce, resource poor, or extremely wealthy and have lots of capital or connections. Either way, if they have a mindset on what it means to understand a sense of place, where am I? And if I'm going to sell this destination and service people who come here, and then more people will come. It's not about marketing the destination. It's about protecting and regenerating the destination. Automatically, that will market itself. Anybody around this table can pay, travel writers from Condé Nast or National Geographic a nice fee. They'll come, they'll write, and the story is told. And Sri Lankan private investors have been doing that. That's what's been bringing some attention. But that's not what's needed from the entrepreneurs. It's that fundamental understanding and depth of the destination. If we went to Arugambe today and asked hotel owners, Sri Lankan or foreign, what it looked like in the 1950s and 60s, most will not be able to tell you. How many people in Colombo and the decision-making seats know that Arugambe was actually a destination where Sinhala planters from Uva and the Badulla Hills would go down to hunt. It was legal, it was regulated hunting, it was very well controlled, and at that time, as a legacy of colonialism, hunting was a method of conservation. It was a big driver for nature conservation, right? And the reason I'm giving this example is because and that's not even that long ago, right? There's a lack of depth in understanding the destination, which is the biodiversity, right? Those Sinhala planters were able to speak Tamil, right? So it's going to the level of community on top of the nature and the ecosystems, right? They could speak Tamil because they were working on the estates, and they would go with some of their helpers from the estates to these regions and connect with the locals. Now, the locals that were there included indigenous communities that were neither Sinhala or Tamil, that we don't even regard today. They exist, and some of them were moved as recently as post-war, right, from inside Kumana, inside Kudumbigala. So they're a core element of nature. So the businesses need to understand that we are still humans. We're living beings. We're not yet robots, as some people like to think, maybe. And therefore, we are central to nature. So once you have that mindset and sort of that awareness, we were talking about mindfulness and having a mental reset, which this country has had multiple opportunities now to achieve, then the entrepreneurs will start acting with a sense of responsibility towards the soil. And business will flourish. I mean, profits will just be abundant, right?
I think it's also important in one way to look at this from the angle of leadership, both in terms of the private sector and in terms of political leadership. See, now we spoke about the SMEs and the small to medium being the largest sector in tourism. These people, these entrepreneurs, they need guidance on what Chalana was talking about. This can be done in two ways. Either the bigger business leaders lead the way and show them and help them, and with government come together and say, okay, this is how we do zero waste, zero plastic. It can be anything, yeah? Or conservation, or how we don't touch certain parts of nature, yes. The other side of this is, like in some other countries, the political leadership has to say, guys, these are the rules, this is what you do, because, not everyone, we are literate. Doesn't mean that everyone's educated. I'm not saying this in a bad way, but this is life. This is fact. So we need that guidance because the government has the largest pot here and has fingers in everything, especially in rural communities. And they have a system in place to do this. So this has to be there too. Because, talking at a high level is all nice, but implementation has to go down that funnel. This is very important to think of in one way when we set policy and when we set goals. That's for private, and policy has to be for the government.
Absolutely. I think we have come to a good segue into Rashmini's thoughts, because Rashmini working in government policy, back in 2017, when I think the conversations around environment may have been in tourism a bit more frontier, given that now there's a lot more focus on climate, particularly after COVID as well. What was your experience, Rashmini? And do you think that the government has given this thought? And if so, where are the barriers that are existing when it comes to translating that thought into policy and then direction and practice?
When you look back into the trajectory of tourism development in Sri Lanka, so it was in the late 1960s that Ceylon Tourist Board was actually formed, and we had a Tourism Development Act. And then we started to see tourism being formally developed, so to speak. At the time and consecutively, it has been very capital intensive. It has been about large scale resorts, and the goals were not necessarily environmental preservation. It was on the sideline. It was to do with employment generation at the forefront and economic regeneration, because we've had issues with balance of payments for a long time. And that's how things were moving along. And we've had growth spurts and then times of decline as well. A similar story that has gone throughout our history. And then in 2017, after a period again, in 2010 to 15, again, there was high capital intensive with international airports, a second airport coming up. So quite heavy on the infrastructure side. And then when we looked at a sustainable tourism model for Sri Lanka at the time, we had World Bank support, Tourism Australia support as well. And we're looking at what can tourism do that is different? Because when you see at the time, and you see this commonly today as well, tourism is seen as an enemy, and this industry that will come and exploit nature, culture, the people, and whereas what we were trying to change the mindset of was tourism as a vehicle and as a catalyst for preservation of natural and cultural assets, to enable them and to enhance them in every possible way. So that was the premise of the Sustainable Tourism Plan, the Vision 2025, and to have collaborative and consensus building in the process. So it was the widest stakeholder consultation for tourism planning at that time. And it was pushing for tourism to be seen in a different light. And we hope that was the discussion at the time. Obviously, a lot of countries were in the same boat, and we were all sort of working towards that sustainability angle. What we're talking about today, though, is on a nature positive front, which is even an evolution of the sustainability angle that we were talking about back then. And there is a lot more that can be done. And I think the mention of the informal sector, which was very, very strong even at that time, and it continues to be, is that there is a lot of good coming out of an informal sector, and we shouldn't discount what they have done and what they are doing. And I know, as looking at it from a government perspective, they were also seen in a different perspective, but it is important to see the value that they create and the very low footprint that they leave behind as well, rather than always considering the largest possible brands, the largest companies. We do need to welcome the informal sector as well and learn from them.
I think we spoke a lot about value setting from a policymaking point of view and also from the supply side. But I think one of the key players are also the tourists. And I mean, if tourists want or don't want this, will also be a huge factor in whether this is practical or not. So what do we see from the tourists, and why? By that, I mean both international and local. When they view Sri Lanka, when they come to Sri Lanka, are they expecting or are they increasingly wanting nature positive economies, or is the supply side and the policy making side struggling when it comes to bridging tourist expectations with maybe broader goals like having a nature positive industry, maybe? Nilanka.
And this comes back to when you have visitors, they come from different places. So now the EU is going to has mandated, I believe, partnerships with nature positive countries. There is a push there. That is basically motivated. It's government. When you have demographics or populations who are a little bit more elevated in the way they think, they want this anyway by themselves outside of the regulation. They don't want a big carbon footprint. They don't want waste. They're like that. We have clients who come to us who'll have functions or weddings, and they're like, we don't do buffets as a policy because it's waste. But even then, they're like, can you donate the leftover food? That's their thinking before they've done anything. That's like the third, fourth question they'll ask us. Right. So, that's from a mental standpoint. That's how they feel. That's the people that they are. So if we don't understand this, we are going to obviously, those are people who have the spending power, who also then means they don't have to come here. They can go to another destination. You spend $400, $500, $600, $700 a night. The whole world is open to you. And there are many places that are already catering to what they are looking for. Number one. Then when we look at the other side of things, there are tourists who will come here because it's a nice place. It's being talked about a lot. Like you said, Condé Nast, Nat Geo, everyone's talking about us. Lonely Planet. And it's cheap to get to. And then what's the mental mindset? Come, bucket list, tick, 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 leave. So where are we and what are we? That's the question that will arise from this. Are we going to look at this from a long-term, again, back to that, or are we going to look at this from a short-term quantitative perspective? We have only one country and nature doesn't recover that fast. So moving on from there, we have a lot of certain places, like you said, the hippie trail is done, dusted. I think going into sustainability and nature positivity there is going to be a bit of a task now because it's established. We can do it with like she said, with the smaller players because they are so carbon neutral and the footprint is so tiny. I mean, you have now little shops on the road where the proprietor, we call him Uncle or Mudalali, will not sell polythene bags. And you know why? It's not that he has thought of it. He has realized his guests, his customers are foreigners who will take what they want in their hands or in their backpacks because it's in a polythene bag. So now he's like, I've understood this in my way, brown paper bags. So if they can do it and we can encourage it, and I think we as businesses also have to learn to look more outward than inward. It's not about us. It shouldn't be. Yes, it is in a way, but we have to think bigger. That then will take everybody up. This is something that really has to come into play from a private perspective. From the government's perspective and from policymakers' perspective, they need to understand the ground realities. Now, say we forget the hippie trail and we move to the untouched parts. And there are plenty of those in this country. Implementation there is possible. A good example of how this failed was Allah is a new destination and is an abject failure. It could have been done well because it started, like he said, Arugambe travelers discovered Allah. We used to stop in Allah to buy curd and have a cup of tea, basically, because that's what it was. So lessons learned are there in front of our eyes. And now more and more new destinations are being discovered in the country. And we can take this. All we have to do is look back at ourselves in a certain way and Google it. And you'll find enough examples, enough policy, enough ways to do it. Implementation, we have challenges here, but anything is possible as long as the mindset is right.
So I think one theme that seems to be running across is the incentive structure to actually transform into a nature positive economy. So coming back into the tourists, Chalana, I would like to know, given that we seem to, in my understanding, we have a diverse group of tourists. We can look at from a source market point of view, we may have tourists from countries which have already been frontiers in nature positive practices. So then those tourists come with expectations. But there could be countries or source markets where that is not the case. Also, we have a significant local tourist population as well. So catering to these diverse tourists, how would the industry manage it? Is it about specializing towards one type of tourist and then maybe having pockets of nature positive activity around? Or is there a way for the industry to navigate this in a common baseline, which is being nature positive?
So that's quite a complex and broad question, which this is a challenge for me to try and be concise with my answer. So please do cut me off. I think it's really important to contextualize and then also translate so that the grassroots SMEs, whoever, if this is going to be translated, can understand. But I think it goes back to the point, long-term thinking is required, which requires a depth going back. So before any of us were even conceived or thought of being conceived thousands of years ago, Marco Polo is claimed to have written that this is the finest island of its size in all the world. So the term that we are stuck on in Sri Lanka is unfortunately tourists. That is a dying term. What humans are evolving into is travelers. And you hear this term now used, digital nomads, but nomadism and nomadic lifestyles have existed for thousands of years, even in this country, right? And you take examples like the Padayatra. What a beautiful heritage. It's now, become something else, like with many things. But you look at the cultural heritage of this island, and I'm not, an expert on the history yet, by no means. Over time, this island, in all the different names that it's had, was attracting travelers. And the travelers came because of the geographic location they stumbled upon or they looked for. And it was not because it was a tourist destination or for holiday. It was an island that was abundant with resources that then became a commercial trading hub. And then it became a commodities trading center globally. Now, post-independence, as Rashmini said, 1950s, 60s, when the Ceylon Tourist Board was set up and so on. The minute tourism was seen as an industry, as an economic driver and an engine, we completely lost the notion of finest island of its size in the world. It suddenly became, okay, how do we generate revenue? So in that process, you're kind of following the bandwagon of other countries which are not the finest islands of their size in the world, but have to create, the world's largest peanut museum and the walnut museum and like this, white painted wall museum. And we have followed that continuously and continue to do so. If you look at our legacy source markets from the 50s and 60s, that was largely Western European, a tiny amount of North American, but largely Western European, a bit of Australian, hippie trail remnants. Now, they are typically the highest GDP per capita spending markets. The United States, to this date, still remains the highest spending market on average per traveler outbound. China is poised to surpass that in 2030 in terms of spend per traveler per trip internationally. The US is a very small market for Sri Lanka. So what we have been stuck in is short-term mindset from the decision makers and powers that be, and as a result, large, big business community. Short-term mindset means I really don't care where this country, could be. I really don't care where this country has come from. I care about paying my bills for tomorrow, day after, and the day after that, maybe. As a result, then, it is almost impossible to provide a national strategy, to provide a national plan, because it is so disenfranchised and so fragmented. Nature of the history of the country from a sociological perspective. Where you can translate to the grassroots is incentives, where to connect with them is to show them the money then. And, in my outreach work and in my advisory work, you show the money in very simple forms. Keep the costs low. And it doesn't really cost you much when you happen to be sitting in paradise. You can't recreate it through capital injections and infrastructure. That's not what's going to happen. The Arugambe surfers of the 60s loved it because they were staying in thatched huts. Those were thatched huts that were sturdy, that were strong, and that the locals lived in. And the locals were transient nomadic populations, some of them, and fishermen, tough and rough lifestyles. But they wanted to sleep in those huts. And typically, if you were traveling in the 50s and 60s, you were affluent, right? It's not Gucci Prada affluent. It's a different type of mindset. What we have as a complex challenge as a country is our geopolitical non-alignment. So while everybody's fighting wars with each other, we welcome the Arabs and the Israelis and the Chinese and the Russians and the Turks and the Americans and everybody. It's a blessing, but also a curse. Because how do you then position the country? And if you look at the type of investments that have gone into tourism and the products that have evolved, the type of Sri Lankan investor is on a political spectrum. Where do their politics align? And as a result, what type of markets are they catering to? I won't give specific examples and names, and you can see this over time. And I think where we really went wrong, and we can comfortably look back at it now because it's been more than a decade, was post-war. And there was that development drive. So what the grassroots, Mudalali and entrepreneurs saw as being tourism development is concrete gala, godanagala, lukuwata tattu paha kadala, mewa dala, cement, building up and building with you is completely different to how they were actually living. And then you create this construction and real estate industry, which is largely debt financed. And then you think it's normal to start borrowing money. And then you think big cars are what they want. And then you think bringing German cars are what they want. And then you think bringing jet skis from country X is what they want. That mindset is where 9 out of 10 Sri Lankans are still stuck. right? And the ones that perhaps are not stuck have chosen to leave. And that's the concern, is when the banking sector is funding projects that replicate the strip in Las Vegas or in Macau, right? Or looking for brand X or Y out of credibility when you have Sri Lankan owner operators who can prove you very healthy balance sheets, small scale. And if you want to talk about nature-based, that's the opportunity, right? You're building with local materials. You're building with highly localized supply chains. Where can you go to eat really good Sri Lankan food on the southern coast? I will pay anybody money to tell me where to eat. That's a commercial establishment, not a private house. You can't find it. How many good seafood restaurants in Sri Lanka are there? Maybe one that I can really say I'll go to Club Ceylon in Negombo. And they do what they do really well because it's out of passion, because they understood the destination. So again, and they're not thinking about, am I catering to German, Russian, Chinese, French, Spanish, Israel? They're thinking about, what is from here? What can I make from here that is economically viable in a very, very challenging economic environment? So talk to those people in a language they understand. Adayama Vedama. Vedama is this, Adayama is... And that's, managing that translates to, okay, you have to be nature positive. Otherwise, you're going to have to be putting air conditioning and you can't pay the electricity bill and you're importing your furniture, right?
Also, Chalana, now, I just brought up Allah. I have nothing against Allah, but...
I do, so... I have
Thank
plenty.
you. Now, you took the word out. I don't say it now. Look at what it is now. Buildings everywhere. And I feel, Norelia, same thing. Pretty soon, Haputale, that area, if they let this go, it's not hard to do. All you have to say is, any building on a hill below the tree line. That's it. And you cut minimum amount of trees around it. So you don't expose it. You leave the greenery. You can still see scenery and luxury means very different things to many different people. Now, what I think is luxury is privacy, is beautiful natural surroundings, silence, and really not too many people interfering with that little portion of my life. And many, many, many people now, that is luxury. That's what they want. They want to see green, they want to see open, they don't want to see lights, they want in the darkness. They can be lit, but you don't want to be in the middle of civilization. You don't want to be in Singapore, you don't want to be in a Kuala Lumpur, Yeah. So what is that? How do we do that? I mean, as basic as I am, sorry Rashmini, I think you put the building permit, like he was saying, you can say, okay, you lease a small amount and go this way, not this way. So you preserve nature in a sense, you preserve the view in a sense. You automatically start to design because you don't have to go this way. You design with nature because you're not allowed to cut into hills. You're not allowed to do, that's not hard to do, I feel at least. So where do we start? I think this is something that really has to be brought to the table, is we understand, I think everyone here and around Sri Lanka in business knows nature is important because we are so raw, and that rawness is what the travelers are looking for. That tourists are not looking for that. That's just what it is. How do we preserve that authenticity? How do we preserve that rawness? I think 90% of it is basically nature, what we have, the biodiversity we have. So what's the starting point? That's a very, very, very important issue that needs to be addressed. All the other things are there too, but where do we start?
Really, the economic crisis is a blessing in disguise, and I say without shame, all the things that happened before are wake-up calls for the country, because the post-war development boom was just unsustainable on every level, particularly for the psyche of the Sri Lankan rich, poor, middle class. So if you translate nature positivity into financially extremely viable and sustainable, that will only continue, right? Because most of these people are seeing tourism as an industry. It's sancharaka vihapara dunakrana because it's adayam. That's the whole rhetoric. No, a few people, Nilanka, you said it before, have understood it's about actually reconnecting to the circadian rhythm. I live in Sri Lanka because I want to get a great, consistent night's sleep. I lived abroad for long enough to have different times. But here you can go to bed at a good time and have no night pollution in many parts of the country, and you don't need air conditioning in many parts of the country. That's the luxury. And what are you selling when you sell a hotel night? We have translated that to Vegas, Dubai, Singapore.
Opulence, basically.
Yeah, and just really artificial material stuff, which are not of this place. They are of other.
So when listening to this conversation, I saw a couple of gaps. The first is this disconnect between short-term thinking and long-term thinking. And then the second is a disconnect between, let's say, individual actor thinking, like that's what happened in Allah, where like every single individual business owner or stakeholder thought of their own immediate environment, but no one really took a step back and looked at the macro. And another gap seems to be the different elements surrounding tourism in a broad scale. We looked at how we position ourselves on a geopolitical sense. We speak about the environment, we speak about investment, financing. So there are a lot of different actors that are being played, and there seems to be gaps in connecting these. So these three gaps, the first actor that comes to my mind in starting to bridging these gaps is the government, is the public sector. So Rashmini, in your experience, how was it when you were drafting policies for the government? Were the stakeholders in unison? Were there challenges when it came to getting all the actors on board? And how do you see the government playing a role as the initiator and as the signaler in getting these gaps connected?
You're right in the expectation that government should be signaling an industry or a sector in the right direction. The right direction means the best possible outcome for nature, for every resource, and for the people that live here. And very often you hear people asking government to respond to the issues that they are currently dealing with and faced with. So whether it is overcrowding in certain areas, if it is over construction, if it is illegal construction, if it is bad business practices, all of that, where do you turn to with those issues? So it is very right that people need to request for higher powers to intervene and set direction. There are a number of stakeholders, and that is one of the challenges for tourism, whether you are a small operator or a larger one, whether it is various government departments that engage in monitoring or preserving their particular assets and feel that they are protecting those assets, to other organizations and departments that are monitoring, measuring, and handling various assets. So tourism falls under every remit, whether even agriculture has a role to play, coast conservation, fisheries, irrigation. It pretty much deals with almost every government department or ministry. That poses its challenges because you have to manage their competing interests. But what we would like to encourage is that tourism should be that enabler. How can we preserve a coast? And as we've all discussed here, how do we go back to our roots of what do we learn from and then take forward? How can we take a little less and give back a little bit more? And that should be the fundamental premise. But that is a challenge because when you have an industry that can grow quite easily, anyone can set up a small tourist business and then grow that. So how, as a government, do you monitor to one extent, regulate to another extent, and also be seen as egalitarian in that very large and widespread industry? Because it is everywhere and it can be set up anywhere. And that is quite a challenge because it's also quite advancing very, very fast, right? So from that small one-bedroom construction to the 5-story construction, that can happen in quite a short span of time. And how do you then, as government, regulate that entire process? The problem has always been policies have come and gone. We've had external agencies supporting us throughout. We've had experts come in, but the implementation, the policing, the consistency has not happened. And that is what has let us down as a country. Sadly, not necessarily only in our sector, in various sectors. And so that is the challenge that we see. And what can government now take on board? Hopefully, whether we can focus heavier on nature and then put nature in the forefront as a way of taking things forward. That could be an answer. That may be an answer that we're, looking into.
See, it's a very contentious. Tell you from my experience. So we work with investors from overseas. Okay, they look at hotspots. Alert being one. I am going to say I veto. I'm like, guys, we are not going there. If you want to do that, please find some other partners to work with, because we can do it, and there's a sense of responsibility that I believe I have to give back. As entrepreneurs, as business owners, as part of society, everyone should have a civic sort of responsibility, but not everybody does. The reality is that this is why the policing part and the regulation part is so important. The education part, the understanding the long-term effects part, really all of this has to mesh together. So given our position or my position, I am able to say, I am not going to Allah. I'm sorry. You want to take this somewhere else with somebody else? Fine. But no, not everybody can do that. Now, if a tourist or a traveler even goes to Allah, meets someone who's from there and says, hey, listen, I want to invest $150,000. I mean, it's a lifeline for him. What's he going to say? Yeah, let's do it. How? Build the cheapest thing possible in the cheapest area possible. That's reality again. So we need policymakers to say, okay, the $150,000 should go to this guy. He deserves it because he's obviously, no one's that. People are smart, they pick the right people, blah, blah, blah. But this is how you implement the use of that 150. And then the sort of framework has to come into play about nature and why we do it, and educate them as to the reasons behind the regulation, the policing, and why are we doing this. It is, end of the day, better for you, better for your children. Think long term. What we do now is not for us, but not even for our kids, should be for our grandkids. Because this soil is really not ours. We are just transient. That understanding has to be there. If you breathe that in, you will automatically look after what is around you. As a society, have to guide, develop, nurture, fix what is happening right now. Maybe that is at least what I think is important, and I think everybody here will agree. In little ways way to do it. And the start, like I said, we start small. We started very small as a country. We are still very small, but we are, everyone's talking about Sri Lanka. Wherever you go, either it's the cricket, which is now not very good, but at least we've been spoken about.
Better past week.
Yeah. So keep that going and turn the conversations into the more long-term, sustainable, looking at things green in a good manner. I think it'll work out. Yeah.
So I want to focus a lot on now the responsible entrepreneur, because now we have been talking about responsibility, and now assume the scenario where we have a responsible entrepreneur. I'm now trying to think of the barriers or the challenges that a responsible entrepreneur in the hospitality industry in Sri Lanka would have if they want to meaningfully become nature positive. And the first question, which I think was alluded to by everyone here, is the money, the financing. Can I access it? I mean, of course, if I have the money to put it, that's good. But 99% of entrepreneurs will need financing options. So how does the financing landscape look like for this very particular question? Nature positive models in the tourism sector. Is the financing sector sensitive to it? Do they have the tools to assess and give financing? As an entrepreneur yourself, have you come across any challenges, and what does it look like? Or what should it look like if it's not looking like what it should right now?
So two-pronged.
Yeah.
First one is SMEs are the biggest part of the business.
Yeah.
They have really no big access to finance. This is a problem, a big one. So when you don't, you have all sorts of other things happening, which is not good. Secondly, what is nature positive financing? I used to be a banker. It doesn't exist. Let's be very honest. We have resources like Chalana who know what it is, who know the advisory behind it, who know the KPIs that are meant to come into play once you go down this road. So it's possible, but short-term view. To be very honest, if you look at profits over profitability, then you have a problem. So access to finance, so you're looking at a project where you want to be green, you want to not disturb the view, you know, all that. It costs you a little bit more money. You're using better materials, you're using sustainable building methods, it costs you more. Are the financiers willing to pay for that? Not really. Do they understand it? I'm not 100% sure, especially locally, because they're looking at only the real estate asset point of view and projections from project financing, blah, blah, blah. More important than this is the fact that the majority of the tourism industry have no exposure to finance. I know from people around me, from the villages that we work in, finance is okay. I go to the bank, I take a housing loan and I build a hotel. That's not business finance. And the banks encourage that and they'll do, I have some dollars here, I have, that's not a robust way to look at this. So we need to, again, it's about understanding what is the need on the ground. Why are they doing what they're doing? And then things will move forward from there. So this really has to be looked at, credit and how it's granted and how it's evaluated from a government level down to a private bank level has to be looked at very, 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 very soon.
Yeah, and I think Chalana, just to ask you about, so I think one important aspect that Nilanka focused was on the KPIs, the sort of verification that is needed to assess these models for financing. So certifications come into that process where certifications might provide a signal, but it will also provide that rigor in a business to meet certain verified or accepted targets. What is the landscape for certification when it comes to the tourism or the hospitality industry in Sri Lanka? And do current certifications really embed nature as a meaningful target? Or as we all know in broader corporate conversations, is greenwashing a thing? And how do we move into something that is meaningful? An indicator that will be trusted by the financiers and also an indicator that will convert certification or signaling into, let's say, investor worthiness?
Yeah, so that's a couple of, again, big questions. And to keep it tangible or understandable, I'm going to backtrack. Culture of accountability. So forget about green financing and all these fancy terms. And I think the success of the SMEs, as Rashmini also mentioned, we need to learn from them, has been the fact that they haven't been able to access capital in professional forms or in institutional capital, if you like. That's brilliant. And I hope that lasts for a bit longer, because those that have is the reason why we are in this mess. We have had access to way too much financing, and we continue to at a national level and then at a corporate level, right? Where is the data for the underwriting of any development, right? Regardless of if it's an eco hotel or a city hotel, or that the country is missing across the board and has no reason to be, because we are far more literate and we have high numeracy literacy as well and IT literacy as well compared to many more successful tourism destinations. So there's no discipline in underwriting in Sri Lankan in the hotel market. And hotels as an asset class, or tourism as an asset class, hasn't been institutionalized for a reason I don't understand. It's kind of the lenders and the bankers and the investment community see it as almost like, oh, we have, X, Y, and Z industry, but this is like a house, but a bit more rooms. And total failure on the part of underwriting, accountability, because there's no data and reporting. The data that exists, we have around 50 properties contributing to STR, right? Of amongst the 2,800 registered SLTDA registered properties in the country. 50 contributing to STR is nothing. Of that 50, a good 20 are contributing since 2017-18, so there's almost no data. Most of them are chain scale affiliated anyway, so they have access to larger data pools. So the culture of no data is going to continue to hold us back when it comes to natural capital, natural positivity, and green financing, if you like it. Because it's all about being able to have third-party verification and proof. We can hold our hands up and say, I'm a responsible operator and so on. And there are many that are doing a brilliant job and they stay away from certification. And frankly, I tell them stay away from it, because you can teach the certifiers how to be genuinely circular, how to actually have zero waste, how to actually provide renewable power from your own resources. So we are at a very great time to be making bold decisions that will have short-term benefits, but much bigger long-term benefits if we start in our small, medium, or large businesses accounting for our basic P&Ls in the right way. What is the cost of my energy? Right. And there's no way you can hide from that because it's a hot topic. What is the cost of food? You can't hide from that either because it's a hot topic. So let's get to the reality on the data on the operations, because the cowboy era post-war is done. People have taken loans. I'm going to drop a number that needs to be verified, but 20% of NPLs of the banks in this country are hospitality assets. Now, a lot of these assets are owned by people who have power and clout. If they are not going to be held accountable, and it's not about, policing people, but it's about, if it's restructuring, but also restructure the approval process on project financing. When you're underwriting cash flows, have justifications for it that automatically are linked. Now, I disagree with some of the comments about the cost of building sustainably. There are 42,000 registered rooms in this country. And there's a lot more unregistered, right? All over the place, eco or non-eco. That was in 2020. So let's say 42,000. 100 years ago, I'm sure there were more than 42,000 houses of some sort on this island. They were not trucking in materials from Italy and, from Indonesia or India or China. They were living in houses, right? And there were other buildings and so on. Why is it so difficult, right? That's a problem at the entire real estate development level. Right? Because what you have taken is this natural piece of capital, which is the island paradise that we're exploiting, slapped a layer on top called property development, and then an operational layer on top called tourism sector. So all of those layers are bridged together. It's a sandwich by the financing, by institutional capital. And where it's not, it's private capital, which are typically doing better. And if they're not doing better, they will fall and they will reinvest elsewhere, or they will downscale and naturally become sustainable. And you can go in and certify them quite easily. So the conclusion here is culture of data and accountability before we talk about nature financing. This is just general financing that we have gotten completely wrong. And we don't have these, Chapter 11 or whatever bankruptcy things. There's no foreclosures. There's no discipline, again, in the business world. I think government's done a great job in many levels, really. But when you have a business community that's pushing to get certain approvals of project X, Y, and Z for their agenda, what can the government do when they themselves have a national agenda to increase employment and revenue? So financial discipline first. Sustainability will come, because if you're financially unsustainable, you can't be ecologically sustainable, right? It's this very simple formula. You don't need me to tell. It's just common sense. It's Buddhist principles. If you want to root it to a nationalist agenda, you really can, right? It's equilibrium and balance of resources, right?
Understood. We have been speaking a lot about changing the tide, but there are actors and there are bright spots that are going against the tide right now. So maybe starting with Rashmini, what are the bright spots that you see right now in this landscape? It could be from policy level, it could be from an individual actor level, that a responsible stakeholder, may it be even a business entrepreneur, it can be a traveler, tourist. What are the bright spots that are there, in your opinion, that we can learn, get inspiration from, and hopefully generalize?
I'd actually like to give you two examples on the spectrum. So one is of being nature positive. So we've spoken about obviously the informal sector and small operators. So we have like the Airbnbs, we have a lot of homestays. The Sri Lanka Tourism Development Authority registers them, and quite a lot are women owned. So a chance to be an entrepreneur on your own. They farm in their own little patches, carbon neutral practically. There's no air conditioning. Very often they're built in or as part of their own homes, and very close to nature, which is one of the reasons they have decided to focus on tourism. So nature has come first, and they have access to nature. So you have a spontaneous butterfly garden sometimes in their backyard, and that is a very small entrepreneur and a small scale example. On the other side, back in 2006, Jetwing launched Viloyana, which is on an abandoned paddy land. They constructed a boutique hotel. At the time, and they will explain to you as well, it was betting on something that had not been done before, land that was completely unused. And today, and during the whole construction, it became developed into a man-made wetland. And in 10 years, one example is that from butterfly species, from 24 species, so they did the metrics, they analyzed the biodiversity increase. From 24 butterfly species, it became 36. You now have the grey slender loris coming in at night. It is their own habitat. And you have urban fishing cat and crocodiles breeding there. So that is an example of a larger operator who decided that their profit would be, take much longer to a typical 10-story hotel, but took a bet on Sri Lanka, an untouched portion of Sri Lanka at the time. Yes, it was in Tambulla area, but it was abandoned land, so not some very lush area. And obviously with the financing and backing, what a large operator can do as well. So I think there are these sides that nature positive economies and what we can do for regeneration. There is the small side and there is a larger player. And we should be able to see both models, the benefits, and as government, how can we provide and incentivize both spectrums of players.
I think today, so we spoke about, I think the crux of our discussion today gravitates towards every stakeholder having discipline and being accountable to themselves and also the broader paradise that we live in. And
to everybody else.
Exactly.
Civic responsibility will always come first.
Absolutely.
We should breed that to some extent, guide. I think we have to start there with ourselves, looking outward, not inward.
Absolutely. And it doesn't necessarily have to start with the government, but clearly the government has a key role to play in it as well. And as Chalana said, financially viable will then lead to ecologically viable. And these two are always, or we should think of it side by side, hand by hand, and we cannot exclude one from the other because at the long run, they're both the same because one can't be there without the other. So that is, I think, a big or strong message to the tourism industry. So thank you so much for an insightful conversation. I'm sure the audience found it insightful. I myself learned a lot from having such diverse ideas here. And please stay connected with the Center for a Smart Future and Echelon Media for more discussions. Thank you so much.